In this video, we're going to look at how we use auto-incrementing columns from PowerBuilder, specifically from the PowerBuilder data window. I'll be using PowerBuilder 12.5. At the time this video is being recorded, that is the most current major version of PowerBuilder. Although the techniques that I'm going to demonstrate today will work with any relatively current major version of PowerBuilder. The first thing, though, we need to look at is what are auto-incrementing columns and why would we want to use them? And to understand that, we need to step back a little bit and ask ourselves, what are the primary means that are used to create primary keys for entities in the database? And there's basically two approaches. The first is to take some attribute, some column of the data itself that actually contains meaningful information and use that as the primary key. For instance, for an employee, you might use social security number. What DBAs and database designers have found over time, though, is that approach has some downsides. Once you've identified that as the primary key for a table in your database, if you've got other tables in that database that are either child tables or related to that table, that data then gets moved into those other tables as well in order to maintain the referential integrity. What might happen is you might find out sometime later that maybe some of this data was entered incorrectly, or that there might be a problem where you may find as the application evolves, that particular attribute no longer actually characterizes the entity properly. Or you may find, let's say in the case of the social security number for an employee, that it becomes tagged as personal identity information, which becomes under some scrutiny, and they may actually ask you to remove it from the database. So in all those cases, you may have cascading update issues. You may have to look at redesigning the database to add a different primary key. So there are a number of issues that you might run into with using what are called intelligent or natural keys. So the other approach is to use what are called non-intelligent keys. Non-intelligent keys are basically arbitrary but unique values that the database assigns to each row in the database that allow you to do the referential integrity. You can copy those data values over to other tables to maintain the referential integrity, but you don't have to worry about them ever being updated or being told that you have to remove them from the database. And different database vendors have different ways of doing that. In the case of Oracle, they have what are called sequences that are separate from the tables. But major vendors such as Deputy Server Enterprise, SQL Anywhere, and Microsoft SQL Server support what are called either auto-incrementing or identity columns, where the column itself in the table will generate unique values for you. So now we know what they are, let's go see how we use them from PowerBuilder. And the first thing we have to do is figure out how do we actually create these in the database itself. And so I'm going to bring up PowerBuilder and we're going to see how we do that. So I'm going to start with SQL Anywhere. Used to be called Deputy Server Anywhere. And what you do is when you create a table here, and I'm going to call this primary key because I'm not particularly imaginative. And what you'll do is you're going to pick one of the numeric data types, decimal, number, integer. I'm going to pick a numeric here. The key for SQL Anywhere is to change the default value to auto-increment. And once you've done that, that's an auto-incrementing column. I'm going to head and create a few more attributes here. There we go. And I'm going to save that. I'm going to put a primary key, identify the primary key. Okay, and then we're going to look at that right here within the data window painter itself. And notice the different types being shown here. That's kind of an indication to you. What PowerBuilder does is it actually uses a data window within the data window painter to display the data. I'll go ahead and insert a value here. I'll put in, let's say, John Strano. And when I save that, notice that this value of 1 came back from the database. I didn't put anything in there originally. So that's the auto-incrementing column actually being used from a data window. Well, the question will be, well, actually, let's look at Adaptive Server Enterprise and SQL Server, Microsoft SQL Server. They both do it. They both do it the same way with regard to each other. They do it a little bit differently than SQL Anywhere. Let's see. I'll use Microsoft SQL Server. And the main difference here is when you go to pick your column type, rather than the default value, what you're going to do is pick a data type that's actually a subtype of the numeric data type. So, for instance, I would pick a numeric identity column. So that's a little subtle difference between the way that the major vendors handle that. Okay, so now we've got our auto-incrementing column, our identity column in the database. How do we reference that from the data window? Well, what you'll do is when you go in here and create your data window, if you go to the rows update properties, you'll see there's an attribute down here called primary key. And the problem here is the data window I created, doesn't have a tab order yet. So I'll create my tab order. Okay. And allow updates. Okay. And then here's the attribute you're concerned about, the identity column. Once you've tagged that column as the identity column, the PowerBuilder knows that it doesn't need to put any value in that column originally. And when it sends the insert statement to the database, it's going to make another operation to go get the value that the database provided. The question becomes, though, how did PowerBuilder know how to go get that value? And to answer that question, we need to go and look at a file that PowerBuilder provides with PowerBuilder called pbodb, and the next three numbers are the major version of PowerBuilder you're working with. And as I indicated, I am using PowerBuilder 12.5, so what you have here is 125. pbodb125.ini in my case. It's located in the shared PowerBuilder folder underneath program files where PowerBuilder is installed. We can go ahead and open that up. And there's a note here at the top that says there's actually some documentation right here in the file at the bottom that indicates what all these data attributes are, all these attributes in the file. So the first thing that PowerBuilder is going to do is going to look at the driver we're using. So let's say we're using the SQL Anywhere driver. And there is a PB syntax attribute underneath there, and so we need to grab that and go find that section of the file. A couple of different database drivers use that same syntax. Here we go. And then at the bottom of that section, towards the bottom, there will be, right here, a get identity attribute. And what that contains is that's the SQL that PowerBuilder is going to use to go get that identity value. In this case, it's going to do a selective add identity. Add identity is a global session value. In other words, it's unique to your session, but it's global across all the tables. So whatever the last identity value in any table was inserted will be in that variable. And there will be an issue with that we'll address here in a minute. But let's go look to see how. Let's say go back to the beginning of the file. Let's go look at SQL Server. There's Microsoft SQL Server. Here's the syntax it uses. We go find that, and we go look for its get identity. Scroll down a little too far. Okay, here we go. And actually, this isn't actually what the original file contained. I modified this. It also had as a default value a select add identity. So it's basically doing the same thing, and the same thing for Adaptive Server Enterprise. But what you'll see here with SQL Server is they've got an alternate that's commented out here. And we'll get to that, and then we get to the caveats that you need to worry about. But the one thing I'll note is that you can change this file and indicate some other syntax that the database should use to go get that value. Microsoft SQL Server has a couple other methods they can use to go get identity values, and so I've specified ident_current as the method that it's going to go use to get that value. And actually, that will take us directly to some of the things you need to watch out for. One of them is this is the reason it's called PBODB XXX is because it's the configuration file for ODBC. But if you're using identity columns, it really doesn't matter what driver you're using. If you're using the Olay DB driver, if you're using the Microsoft SQL Server native driver, if you are using identity columns, you're still going to need to deploy this file with your application, because this is what PowerBuilder is going to go use to try to figure out how it's going to get the value out of that identity column. The other caveat you need to watch out for, as I mentioned, this is a global session value. This add identity is a global session value. SQL Anywhere is actually pretty good about how it handles it. If you've got a trigger in the database, let's say it's on the column that you're doing the insert into, and it goes ahead and it inserts into another column in the database that also contains an identity column, what SQL Anywhere will do is it will take the original value of that add identity column and basically treat it as a stack. It will push it down. Within the trigger itself, it will use the new value it obtained for that other table. And when the trigger ends, it will pop that value back off and bring back up the value that you originally had on your insert, and it will return it to you. So we're pretty good there with SQL Anywhere. The problem with Microsoft SQL Server and Adaptive Server Enterprise is they don't have that capability. And so if you've got a trigger on your table and it goes out and inserts into another table that has an identity column in it, add identity is not going to work for you. And so that's when you start using, for instance, this one method that they provided as an alternate, selecting the maximum value from that column from the table. That causes some problems as well. If you've got a high transaction system, and depending on how you've got your isolation level set up, you could either cause some blocking of updates, or you could allow somebody else to go up there and update that table as well and end up getting their value rather than your value. So there's a couple of things you need to watch out there for. It's really only a problem if you've got triggers on the table that turn around and insert into other tables that have identity columns in them, though. The last caveat I'll mention is that these auto-incrementing columns, these identity columns, what the database does when you first pop a value from them is it creates a cache of values, so that it doesn't have to keep going and regenerating a value each time. It'll generate 20 or 30 values, and then usually that's customizable, but it will generate a series of values for that column, give you the first one, and then when you do later inserts, it will just hand them to you out of the cache. The problem is what happens when you shut down the database or it crashes. What happens, all those cache values get thrown away, and then when you go to do another insert in the table, it just starts over from where it left off as far as the end of the cache. What that creates are gaps in the sequential values. So you really shouldn't care about what the values are, but if you are in a situation where you need to have sequential values and you can't have gaps, you do not want to be using an auto incrementing or identity column for that, because you won't get that effect. The other thing I'd caution you about is when you're sizing the column, you may be thinking, oh, I need to only store less than 100,000 rows. I'll make it a 5-digit column. Well, because of the burn factor caused by throwing away these cached values, you may find that in order to keep 90,000 rows in your table, you may need more than 100,000 sequential values from your identity column. And that means you may need to make sure that your columns actually sized correctly. It would need to be a 6 or a 7 to actually hold all the values you're going to be generating. Well, that does it for today. I hope you've enjoyed the presentation and maybe learned something about how auto-incrementing columns can be a great asset to you and how PowerBuilder supports them. Thanks for your attention.